A silver locket no bigger than a quarter lay face up on wet stones. The hinge bent, the chain knotted with grit. The creek was running low that afternoon, no more than 6 inches of cold water slipping around it, but the metal still flashed when the sun touched it, 2 smiling faces sealed behind fogged plastic, the kind of smiles people wear on day 1 before a trail turns into a story. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and hit like and subscribe if you believe some names should never fade. Most weekdays that summer, I woke before the gulls and the garbage truck padding barefoot across cool kitchen tile while the coffee maker sighed to life. Port Angeles is a place that keeps its voice low in the morning. On clear days, you can see across the Strait of Juan de Fuca to the blue shape of Canada, and on fog days, you hear only what's close porch chains ticking a screen door, taking a breath, the paper sliding under a car tire. The air in July sits around 65 at sunrise, damp, as a towel hung too long, and the smell of cedar comes in through the window, even when you think it's shut. I never minded the gray. It softens hard things. It made our small house on Park Avenue feel like it was tucked into a sweater. By then I'd been retired almost 2 years. After 3 decades in a high school office ringing bells and afternoon announcements and locker doors clapping like hands, I told myself I'd learn how quiet works. I took small jobs that didn't need titles, stacking canned goods at the church pantry, repainting the Little League dugout, driving Mrs. Harrow's chewed-up Ford to the shop and back because her hands shook on the wheel. When people asked if I missed the kids, I told the truth. I missed the noise more than the arguments. Mia thought that was the most principal answer a father could give. She'd stop by in that old Subaru with the stubborn passenger window sand from a dozen beaches in the floor mats. She lived down in Seattle by then, working part-time and pitching photo essays to magazines that paid in small checks and big promises. "Light is a living thing," she said once, standing in our driveway and tilting her head so the sun lit just one eye. I nodded as if I understood the way a father nods at talk of lenses and ISO and how fog eats edges. She had a way of holding her camera like a dog carries a stick, proud and practical at once. Sophia and Lila came up that second weekend in July 1, with a cooler full of cut fruit and tortillas, the other with a slim stack of laminated maps that felt like playing cards. They matched in spirit more than in looks, a threesome that clicked into place without trying. I'd seen them sprawled on our living room rug since college days, scheduling their lives in pencil and arrows, big city jobs that still left room for mountains and salt water. They never walked into a room without filling it with motion, arms to shoulders, elbows to elbows, voices climbing and dropping around each other like good harmony. They had permits for a 3-day loop starting at the Hoh Rainforest Trailhead about 80 miles west from my front door, if you take the bends proper and don't try to shave minutes by passing logging trucks. The plan had the sure feel of something prepared mileage written in blue pen camp miles apart, marked in red and alternate route, highlighted in yellow in case the river sat too high. They checked weather on my home computer, mid-70s during the day, a dip into the 50s at night, light westerly winds, low chance of showers. I remember they laughed about the low chance because the peninsula never met a forecast it didn't want to change. We grilled chicken in the backyard. Lila rinsed romaine in a plastic colander, the cold from the tap stinging her wrists. Sophia lined up their gear on the patio table like a nurse laying out instruments cartridges for the water filter. A coil of paracord bear canisters, headlamps, 3 whistles, a tiny repair kit with needles and thread. They weighed the food bags on my old spring scale, adding and subtracting ounces, as if those ounces were quarters. I'd taught overthinkers, and I'd taught underthinkers. This trio sat in the small, sweet middle. Careful, but not scared. Mia wore a silver locket that day, a little thing with a hinge that preferred to stick. Inside was a photo booth, stripped 3 faces crushed together and half out of frame the way people do when the booth decides it's ready before you are. She held it once between finger and thumb and said, "It's our marker." I didn't ask what that meant. A father learns which parts of a sentence are for his ears and which are for the air. Ranger Harlan Brooks stopped by our backyard fence that afternoon, which at the time felt like nothing more than a small-town courtesy. He'd been around for years, tall, sinewy, the lean you see on men who spend long days in boots. He told the girls the elk were down in the lower meadows and warned them not to underestimate the afternoon heat, which dries you out faster than you think when the breeze hides it. He smiled without showing teeth and tapped the permits with 2 fingers the way an officer taps a warning on a windshield instead of writing a ticket. "See you back here Wednesday," he said. I thought it was a kind thing to say. Before night, the house started doing the little jobs that keep dads busy. I checked the porch light. I found extra APA batteries. I put a plastic tub by the door so wet boots wouldn't mark the entry tile when they came back. Sophia washed dishes with sleeves shoved up, humming one of those aimless songs people hum when they're working with their hands. Lila stood in the doorway talking about the kids in her classroom, first graders who measured days by recess and apples, and I made a joke about sneaking extra minutes into spelling tests if you call them field spelling. Mia didn't laugh. She watched the sky go pink over the neighbor's firs and took a photo I never saw. The peninsula holds on to light late in July. 10 o'clock can touch the eaves and still leave a blue rim over the hills. The girls slept in the living room, 1 on the couch, 2 in sleeping bags, and I could hear small sounds from down the hall after the house had settled. Zippers tugged someone turning a page, a whisper that rode the carpet. I kept the window above the sink cracked and let the marine air lift the curtains an inch back and forth in a slow pulse. For once, I didn't think about bells or permission slips. The day was a bowl that held itself upright. Morning started with that Subaru and the smell of gasoline that's older than the car. We packed fast. I tucked cash in the glove box and a paper map behind the visor, even though they had 3. I reminded them about the time we saw a black bear on the shoulder near Lake Crescent, and how it looked like somebody in a heavy coat who'd given up on walking like a person. They loaded bear canisters like puzzle pieces. You could hear pan lids and buckles and the thump of boots in the back. Brooks passed the house again in a government truck going the other way. He lifted 2 fingers off the wheel. If I'd known what to keep, I would have stood in the driveway longer. Instead, I did what men my age do when we feel too much, made sure the trash lid was seated, wrote the pickup day on the wall calendar, even though it never changes, wound the grandfather clock that doesn't need winding. They pulled away to the sound of their own laughter tires flicking small gravel into the air. Lila's hand came out the passenger window, fingers spread against the wind, like she was measuring speed in inches. The porch light clicked off when the door shut, as if the house approved. The Hoh trailhead sits in a cathedral you can smell before you see. They called mid-morning from a payphone near the visitor center because reception quits on you the minute you get honest with the trees. "We're good," Mia said. "We'll be back before you miss us." I told them to write that line down because a good line needs a place to live. When I hung up, I watched the clock hands just to prove to myself time moved the same for all of us. The day itself didn't ask for attention. I mowed the strip of lawn that always grows faster next to the neighbor's hydrangeas. I ate a ham sandwich at the sink and let the crumbs fall into my palm. In the afternoon, I walked the waterfront trail. The ferry churned a white tail into the strait, and boys in hoodies leaned over the rail to spit and watch their own aim. I bought cherries from a man who weighs with his eyes and always adds 1 extra to the bag with a wink. When I brought them home, I put the best-looking 5 aside in a bowl because saving the best is how you keep people close even when they're not here to see it. Little things show their edges before big things do. Late afternoon, a gust rocked the wind chime and then went still the way sound does in a gym when the ball hits the rim and hangs for an extra heartbeat. The neighbor's beagle Lemon barked once and then did that soft throat noise dogs make when they've heard something they can't sort yet. A red taillight reflection slid across the living room wall, though no car passed, just the sun finding its way through a moving branch. Years later, that's the moment I go back to like a needle finding a groove, nothing to point at yet, a feeling that borrowed my breath. They were supposed to call from the trail junction at 5 just to say they were dropping into the quiet where phones don't follow. 5 came and went without harm. I told myself they'd been moving steady and beat the turn by 20 minutes. I set the table with 3 side plates out of habit and then stacked 2 of them again because it felt almost superstitious to leave them there like asking for a wish out loud. I folded a dish towel and unfolded it and folded it again. The porch took the last of the warm light and made it look softer than it was a trick wood does when it's old and loved. I stepped outside to breathe the kind of evening air we get here, spruce and salt, and a faint iron tang from the shipyard, and listened for a car that wasn't on our street yet. A bicyclist rattled past, hauling a trailer with a dog wearing goggles. Across the way, Mrs. Harrow switched on her lamp with the seashell shade, and the room glowed the color of egg yolk. I thought about the first time I took Mia to the Hoe, how she made me read every single sign out loud, even the ones about mushrooms that look like they've been painted. "The forest is a person," she said. Then small hand trapped in mine because she wanted to feel her fingers bump against my knuckles. I told myself 5:30 was as good as 5. 6 wasn't late if the trail was generous. The clock in the hallway ticked with a metronome patience that didn't belong to my chest. I turned on the porch light before the sky asked for it. It threw a warm circle across the railing and caught the dust in the air the way stage lights catch chalk. Down the block, somebody's sprinklers came alive. I stood there a minute longer, holding nothing at all in my hands, and watched that light burn against the first thin blue of evening just to make sure it would be easy to find the house when the headlights swung back into our driveway. By the time the first night settled in, that porch light had burned longer than I meant for it to. The street out front was still, except for the soft hum of insects and the sound of a flag rope knocking against a pole 2 houses down. I remember checking the clock again just after midnight, telling myself they'd probably made camp early, maybe lost track of time, or found a spot where the trees swallowed their signal. I turned off the light and went to bed, but I kept waking. Every creak in the floorboards, every breeze through the screen sounded like footsteps that didn't belong. By dawn, I gave up pretending to sleep. I brewed coffee and stared at the road, waiting for headlights that never came. That first morning of silence didn't alarm me. I told myself they'd check in once they hit a ridge with better reception. When noon rolled by and nothing came through, I called the park office. The ranger on duty said not to worry. 3 days was typical for that loop. I thanked him, hung up, and tried to keep my voice steady. By the second day, I caught myself glancing toward the kitchen window every few minutes, listening for that car. I even drove out to the Hoe Visitor Center on a thin excuse about dropping off extra batteries. The parking lot was half empty, the air heavy with pine and rain about to fall. I waited near the bulletin board where hikers logged their routes, half hoping, half terrified they'd come walking down the trail laughing about how bad the reception was. They didn't. On the morning of the 18th, I called again. This time it wasn't routine. The girls should have checked out by noon the previous day. The ranger who answered put me on hold, and the silence on that line stretched until I could hear my own heartbeat in my ear. When she came back, her voice had changed. She said they were initiating a search. That word search lands in your stomach like cold iron. She took down our address, promised someone would be in touch, and asked me to stay home in case they called. Within hours, the quiet town I'd always trusted shifted into something unrecognizable. Helicopters rolled over the hills low and slow, rattling the windows. You could hear them miles away before you saw them. Trucks from the ranger service lined the edge of the highway, men and women stepping out with radios clipped to their vests and maps spread across their hoods. It was strange watching people move with such precision, while I stood still, hands empty, not knowing where to put them. The air smelled of fuel and wet earth, a mix that still takes me back every time it rains. They found the first camp late that evening, 2 miles off the main loop near a small creek. The ranger who called me was calm, practiced the way people sound when they've learned how to deliver bad news without saying it outright. The tents were damaged, he said. Gear scattered. Looked like maybe an animal. But no blood, no clear sign of what happened. He said they'd expand the perimeter at first light. I thanked him, though I couldn't tell you why. Words fall out of you when the world stops making sense. I drove out early the next morning against their advice. The main road into the park was already sealed with orange cones and a hand-painted sign that read, "Authorized personnel only." I parked behind a ranger truck anyway and walked until a young officer stopped me. His boots were caked in mud, his face drawn and sleepless. "You can't be here, sir," he said, polite but firm. I told him who I was. He hesitated, then pointed toward a makeshift base set up in the visitor lot. "Talk to Ranger Vasquez." That's how I met Elena. She was smaller than I expected, hair tied back, clipboard tucked under one arm, voice steady, like a metronome. She told me what they knew, which wasn't much. No tracks beyond the campsite, no sign of wildlife aggression, no gear that suggested they'd planned to leave early. She said they'd run scent dogs along the creek and into the tree line. The dogs had picked up something faint, then lost it near a washout. She showed me a topographic map, red circles marking search zones. Her finger rested on one spot longer than the others. "This area here," she said quietly, "is where we'll focus today." I remember the smell of pine sap, the crunch of gravel under her boots, and how everyone avoided looking at the family members who'd begun to arrive. Sophia's mother stood near her car, both hands clutched around a photo, her lips moving in prayer. Lila's father paced the asphalt, muttering the same question to every ranger who passed. "Have you found their packs?" as if repetition might change the answer. I just sat on the tailgate of my truck waiting for something to make sense. The search went on for days. Each night the helicopters returned to base, the hum fading into the dark, and I'd drive home under a sky that looked too calm for what it was hiding. News vans began to line the highway pullouts, reporters trying to turn grief into airtime. They called the girls the Olympic Three. It sounded too neat, too small for who they were. The newspapers ran their college photos, bright faces, unaware of what captions would one day sit beneath them. On the 5th day, a searcher found one of Mia's boots half buried near the creek bank. Same brand, same size. I asked to see it, but Elena said it was better that I didn't. The rain came in hard that afternoon, the kind that eats tracks and carries things downstream. When the dogs came back empty again, you could feel the shift, the unspoken turn from rescue to recovery. But no one dared to say it. I stayed in Port Angeles even after most volunteers went home. Every evening, I'd drive out to the park boundary park near the entrance sign and wait. I don't know for what an update, a mistake, a miracle. One night, long after midnight, a truck pulled up beside me. The driver's window rolled down and a man in uniform nodded. It was Ranger Brooks. I recognized him from the day the girls left. He looked tired, almost hollow. "You should go home, Mr. Carter," he said. "The forest has a way of keeping its own time." I didn't answer. He lingered a second longer, eyes fixed somewhere over my shoulder, then drove off into the dark. Something about him stayed with me, the tone, the way his gaze never quite met mine. Still at the time, I didn't know what to make of it. I chalked it up to exhaustion. Everyone out there was running on fumes. The next morning, Elena mentioned he'd filed the initial report on seeing the girls at the trailhead, said they'd checked their permits, and seemed fine. It sounded ordinary enough, but something in her expression told me she wasn't sure it was. Weeks passed. The forest began to swallow the signs of the search tire tracks, covered in moss, flagging tape, fading under rain. One by one, families went back to their lives that no longer fit right. We organized vigils, candlelight gatherings on the waterfront where we said their names aloud. Each flame looked fragile against the wind, like hope trying to hold its shape. Reporters moved on to new tragedies, and the calls from the park slowed until they stopped. The official word was unresolved. Then late in September, Elena called. She'd been going through archived footage from wildlife cameras, one of those small tasks people do when they can't let go. Most of the clips were harmless deer nosing through ferns, raccoons sniffing at the lens. But one file stopped her cold. It showed 3 hikers walking single file along a narrow trail, Mia in front, Sophia behind, Lila last. The date stamp matched the day they vanished. 20 seconds later, the frame caught motion in the background, a figure standing behind a tree half hidden. He lifted binoculars. Even in grainy black and white, the shape of his hat and jacket were unmistakable park ranger issue. She didn't tell me that over the phone. She waited until I came in. When she showed me the footage, the room seemed to tighten around us. I remember the hum of the monitor and the smell of dust from old carpet. Elena hit pause, and there he was, frozen, a man whose job was to keep people safe, watching 3 women disappear into the fog. She said they'd already identified him, Ranger Brooks. They questioned him that same week. He claimed he'd been patrolling, making sure hikers followed the right trail. said he'd never approached them, that the camera angle made it look closer than it was. His report said he'd returned to his cabin before nightfall, but his alibi didn't hold up. No one saw him there, no radio check-in, no patrol log entry after 6 p.m. He had a reputation for being thorough, almost obsessive, yet his paperwork that night was blank. The investigators combed through old complaints, women hikers who'd said they felt watched, a few who reported a ranger shadowing them from a distance. Nothing that ever stuck, but enough to sketch a pattern. They searched his cabin, a small clapboard shack near the Quinault boundary, and found nothing but coffee cups, old field guides, and a shortwave radio that crackled even when unplugged. Still, the silence around his name started to thin. The rangers who'd once vouched for him began speaking carefully, like people testing ice. That fall dragged itself toward winter. Fog thickened along the highway, and the air took on that wet metal taste that comes before snow. I spent most evenings sitting by the window flipping through Mia's notebooks. She'd drawn trail maps on napkins, labeled them with small notes in pencil moss, bright as neon stream, cold enough to hurt. I'd trace those words with my thumb and try to imagine what she saw that last day. One night in early November, Elena came by the house. She didn't call first. She just knocked rain dripping from her hat. When I opened the door, she looked like she hadn't slept in days. They'd found something new, she said quietly, a strand of hair on one of the slashed tents from the original campsite. It didn't match any of the girls. They were rushing DNA comparison now. Her eyes met mine, steady but heavy. "We're close," she said. "I just don't know to what." That night I couldn't bring myself to turn off the porch light. The rain fell straight down, no wind to carry it, and the bulb made every drop shine before it hit the railing. Somewhere beyond the dark line of trees, machines hummed generators from the search team still working late. The house smelled of damp wood and coffee gone cold. I thought about that creek where the locket was found, how light can catch on the smallest thing and make you think it's hope. I stayed by the window until the lamp flickered and the woods went black again, holding more than they should. When morning came, the rain had turned the street into a gray mirror. I sat at the table with the blinds half open, watching it trace crooked lines down the glass. The porch light still burned, haloed by drizzle. I hadn't slept, just drifted in and out of half-dreams, where footsteps circled the house and stopped short of the door. The phone finally rang at 6:42. It was Elena. Her voice had that tone people use when they're trying to keep themselves upright. The lab had rushed the test. The hair they found on the tent belonged to Ranger Brooks. I remember the pause that followed, like she was waiting to hear what that did to me. But what could I say? My mouth went dry, and all I managed was, "What happens now?" They brought him in that afternoon. The local paper would later call it routine questioning, but I'd seen enough to know it was anything but. Elena told me later how it went, how he sat at the end of the table, with his hands folded, his ranger hat set neatly beside him, as if that small act of order could erase what was coming. He said he'd already explained everything he was patrolling doing his job. The forest was big, easy to misinterpret where a man stood. But then they showed him the footage, the grainy stills of him watching from the trees, and his face changed. His jaw tightened. Not guilt yet, but fear of where the conversation was headed. I wasn't in that room, but I imagined the air felt heavy. Elena said he kept glancing toward the window, toward the line of trees visible from the station parking lot. When they mentioned the campsite, the boot prints, the slashed tents, his breathing turned shallow. One of the detectives asked him about the night of July 15th. He said he'd gone home early, felt unwell. No one could confirm it. The logs were empty, the cabin dark. Then they told him about the DNA. That's when his eyes filled. A man can hold on to denial until something with numbers next to it shows up. Then it's over. He confessed late that night. It wasn't dramatic, no raised voice or slamming fists, just a slow unraveling, a kind of weary surrender. He said he'd watched them hike in, couldn't help himself. Lonely, he called it. Said he admired how they laughed together, how they didn't seem afraid of the woods. He followed from a distance for hours. When he found their camp, he convinced himself he was checking on them, doing his duty. Then, according to him, something shifted. Sophia, always the brave one, challenged him, asked why he was there. Maybe she saw the wrongness before anyone else did. He said he lost control, that the whole thing just happened. That phrase stuck with me, just happened, as if the wind knocked the world sideways and he went along with it. He described panic, how they fought, how he struck out and didn't stop soon enough. Then silence. He said the other two tried to run. One slipped near the creek. The rest blurred into chaos. When he finished, he broke down crying, begged to see a chaplain. The officers let him. They said he wept for hours, though I never learned if it was for them or for himself. I found out about the discovery 2 days later. Elena called again. Her voice was lower this time, careful. "We located them," she said. That was all she could manage before the words caught. She didn't say where or how. I didn't ask. When the official statement came, it said divers had recovered the remains from a lake tucked behind a waterfall, an area so remote most hikers never knew it existed. The girls had been weighted down with rocks and tarp. I drove out there once, weeks later, just to stand at the trailhead. The air smelled of moss and diesel from the rescue boats. The water itself was still almost glass, and I remember thinking it didn't look capable of hiding anything. The recovery was slow and careful. Each item cataloged, photographed, bagged. I sat in the sheriff's office as they read the list tent fabric, a metal cooking pot, a camera cracked through the lens, one silver locket. My throat closed at that last one. They asked if I wanted to see it. I said no. Some things, once you look, you can't unsee. When they told the families, we gathered in a small community hall downtown. The Rangers came in uniform, hats pressed to their chests, eyes lowered. Elena stood at the front, shoulders squared but trembling at the edges. She read the statement, her voice cracking once before she steadied it again. Brooks had been charged with 3 counts of manslaughter. He'd confessed in full. His cabin contained photographs, dozens of hikers, mostly women, taken from a distance. The words hung in the air like smoke. Some people gasped, others just went quiet. I remember the sound of chairs shifting, fabric creasing, small movements that said more than any words could. Afterward, I stepped outside into the cool night. The air had that metallic edge rain leaves behind. Across the lot, camera lights flashed as reporters cornered whoever would talk. I didn't. A young woman with a microphone still asked me, "Do you believe justice will be served?" I told her, justice wasn't the right word, not for something like this. What you get isn't justice, it's the least unfair outcome left. The trial began that November. It drew crowds from every corner of the county. Reporters camped outside, trucks lined the street, and people who'd never met the girls brought flowers just to feel part of something decent. Inside, the room was so quiet, you could hear the click of the court reporter's keys. Brooks looked smaller than before, his uniform gone, wrists bound in steel. When the prosecutor read his confession aloud, he didn't raise his head once. I watched him the entire time, waiting for any sign of remorse, a wince, a tremor. But all I saw was fatigue, like a man who finally met the weight he'd been carrying. The defense tried to paint him as a broken soul, divorce, isolation, too many years alone in the woods. But none of that filled the empty chairs behind me. When they described how the girls died, I saw Sophia's mother clutch her husband's sleeve so tightly her knuckles went white. I saw Lila's father close his eyes and whisper something I'll never know. And when they read from Mia's journal entries about the trip, her handwriting steady and cheerful, it broke something in me I didn't know could still break. He took a plea to avoid the death penalty, life without parole. When the judge handed down the sentence, no one clapped, no one cheered. We just sat there. The courtroom emptied slowly like people leaving a funeral they weren't ready to end. I stayed until the deputies let him out. He glanced my way once. Not apology, not defiance, just recognition. Then he was gone. In the weeks after the park changed, new signs went up at trailheads warning hikers to check in daily, to report suspicious behavior, to trust their instincts. More cameras were installed, little red lights blinking in the trees like watchful eyes. Elena told me she'd pushed for annual psychological evaluations for all rangers, something she said should have existed long before. We failed them, she admitted quietly one evening, the both of us standing outside the ranger station. I didn't argue. Failure seemed too small a word. The families built their own forms of survival. Sophia's brother started a scholarship for women in outdoor education. Lila's mother planted a garden behind the elementary school where her daughter once taught. I spent my days sorting through Mia's photographs, labeling the ones I could bear to keep boxing the rest. There was one from that final morning mist curling over the trees, sunlight threading through like gold wire. She'd captioned it in pencil on the back, proof that the world can be kind. I keep it framed by the kitchen window now, though I've never stopped wondering how quickly kindness can vanish when the wrong person decides to follow you. Winter came early that year. The mountains turned white and the trails closed under ice. I tried walking near the waterline some nights, the cold air clearing my head, but every gust of wind through the cedars sounded like a whisper of something unfinished. There were rumors, always are after cases like this, that he wasn't the only one out there watching. Old complaints resurfaced, unconfirmed sightings, campers who swore they'd been shadowed in the dark. The park dismissed most of them, but that kind of talk has a way of sticking. A few weeks before Christmas, Elena stopped by again. She'd just come from inventorying Brooks's cabin one last time before it was sealed for good. "You should know," she said, setting a small folder on my table. Inside were photographs. Nothing graphic, just images of scenery. Trees, rivers, sky. But one photo stood out, a shot of a narrow canyon, water pooling at the bottom. In the distance, barely visible, 3 figures moved along the ridge. Elena said they'd been taken a day before the girls vanished. The timestamp matched. The figures were too small to identify, but I didn't need to. I kept that photo. It sits in the same box as Mia's camera strap and the map they drew before they left. Sometimes I take it out not to punish myself, but to remember how quickly beauty can turn dangerous. The park has since restored that trail, reopened it to hikers. They renamed the lookout above the lake after the 3 of them. I've gone there once, stood at the edge, wind pressing against my chest, listening to the water move beneath the falls. For a moment, I could almost hear their laughter, faint but clear, like echoes from a world that never learned how to protect them. Elena once told me that when the confession ended, when Brooks had said his last word and the tape clicked off, she stayed in the room alone for a while. She said it felt like the forest itself had exhaled, relieved, and haunted all at once. I think about that sometimes, especially when the wind shifts and the house creaks like an old tree bending under its own weight. The storm that took my daughter and her friends is over on paper, but some storms don't end. They just change shape, move into the corners of your life, and wait. And sometimes, when the night is still enough, I swear I can hear the faint rustle of their laughter traveling through those trees, carried by a breeze that never quite stops. Winter never really leaves the peninsula. It just hides behind a layer of fog that smells like wet cedar and salt. Months had passed since the sentencing, yet I still woke every morning at the same time Mia used to call. That hour between dark and light, where nothing moves, where the world feels like it's holding its breath. I'd stand at the kitchen sink, staring out past the yard, watching mist drift low over the road, and wait for the sound of tires that would never come. Grief has a strange rhythm. Some days it hums, other days it sits quiet, waiting for you to breathe wrong so it can remind you it's still there. In early spring, I got a call from Elena. Her tone had that familiar hesitation, the kind that meant there was news, but not the kind that brought comfort. A hiker had found something down near Salduke Falls, close to where the first campsite had been discovered years before. Probably nothing she said, but I thought you'd want to know. That area had been combed countless times, but the park had taken a beating that winter storms, flooding trees down across the trails. The river had shifted course, tearing through sections that hadn't seen daylight in decades. Things that were buried had a way of coming back up. When I arrived, the air was heavy with that damp chill that creeps into your clothes and stays there. I followed Elena down a narrow path slick with moss until we reached a small clearing by the water. She pointed to a muddy patch near a fallen log. Half buried in the soil was a rusted knife with a handle wrapped in duct tape. It looked old, corroded, like it had sat there through a dozen seasons. The rangers had already roped it off, waiting for the evidence team. "Could be from an old poacher's camp," she said, though I could hear the uncertainty. A ranger's badge might teach you to control your voice, but it can't hide what your eyes give away. We stood there for a long time, listening to the water rush through the ravine. It wasn't lost on either of us that the place looked almost peaceful now, the kind of beauty that makes you forget what's underneath. When the team bagged the knife, I noticed something else, an indentation in the mud roughly the size of a small pouch or wallet. As they cleared it, a scrap of leather surfaced, darkened by years of weather. Inside was a silver locket, its clasp broken, the surface scratched beyond polish. Even before they cleaned it, I knew. I recognized the curve of it, the faint engraving along the edge. I didn't have to open it to know whose faces were inside. The lab confirmed it later. It was Mia's. The same locket she'd worn that last morning in our driveway. What didn't make sense was where it had been found miles from the lake where they'd recovered the girls. The terrain between those 2 points wasn't passable, not without crossing deep water or steep drop-offs. The only explanation was the flood that hit during that summer storm, the one that turned the creeks into rivers and stripped whole trees from the banks. Maybe the current had carried debris from the crime scene downstream. Maybe Brooks, in his panic, had tried to scatter evidence before the storm. Or maybe, and this thought kept me awake more nights than I'll admit, someone else had moved it. Elena ordered a quiet re-examination of the area. She didn't want to spook the families again, not without proof of something new. They brought in geologists to map how the water had flowed that year. The results were strange. The pattern didn't match a typical flood path. There was too much debris clustered near one ridge, too little downstream. It was as if someone had dammed the flow for a time, then released it. That's when Elena started digging through old ranger logs, looking for any mention of maintenance or construction near the falls. She found one entry, a repair request signed off by a man named Dale Marrow. I remembered that name faintly from the early reports. Maintenance crew short-term hire fired once before for theft, rehired the year the girls disappeared. Back then, he'd been assigned to work under Brooks maintaining backcountry trails and storage facilities. No one had connected him to the case because he'd left shortly after the disappearance, claiming family issues. He'd been questioned, cleared, and forgotten. But now, years later, his name sitting beside that strange discovery felt like a door reopening. Elena tracked him down to a small trailer park in Aberdeen. He'd been living alone, working odd jobs, barely scraping by. When investigators first approached, he claimed not to remember much about that summer. Just fixed bridges and cleared brush, he said. But when they mentioned the locket, his hands began to shake. The story that followed came in fragments, half-mumbled sentences, long pauses, a man trying to measure how much of his soul to show. He admitted he'd been with Brooks that night, not when it started, but after. He said Brooks had shown up at his door past midnight, soaked and shaking, babbling about an accident. He needed help, Dale told them. He followed Brooks into the woods, not asking questions until it was too late. By the time they reached the lake, the damage was done. Brooks was moving through the water, tying something heavy beneath the surface. Dale said he tried to turn back, but Brooks threatened him, said they'd both hang if the truth came out. They spent the next day hiding what they could before the storm came. "I didn't kill them," he kept repeating. "I just helped make them disappear." The confession didn't surprise me. What did surprise me was how small his voice sounded when Elena played me the recording later. You could hear the remorse, or at least something pretending to be it. He said he'd kept one thing, the locket, because he couldn't stand the thought of it sinking with the rest. He carried it for years, a kind of punishment he couldn't throw away. When the floods came, his trailer washed out, and he lost it somewhere near the ridge. Fate, I suppose, has a way of digging up what people try to bury. They arrested him quietly that September. The charge was accessory to manslaughter. It didn't bring anyone back, but it filled in one last blank space on the map. The trial was shorter this time, quieter too. Most of the press had moved on, and the courtroom felt like a faded echo of the first. Dale pleaded guilty. He didn't look at the families, didn't say he was sorry. The judge gave him 25 years. I watched as they led him out, his hands trembling in front of him, like someone who knew the ghosts were coming whether he lived or not. Afterward, Elena stopped by with something she'd kept, a photograph recovered from Brooks's cabin, one they'd missed before. It showed a narrow canyon sunlight cutting through the trees, water pooling below. 3 figures stood on the ridge in the distance. The timestamp was the day before the girls vanished. "He took this," she said, sliding it across the table, "probably with a telephoto lens. The edges of the print were curled, the colors faded to sepia. I stared at it for a long time before realizing I wasn't breathing." By then, the park had changed again. New signs warned hikers to check in, new rangers patrolled with cameras on their vests. The trails where they'd walked were reopened, though few went that deep anymore. People said the forest felt heavier now, quieter, as if it remembered. The lake where they were found was renamed Reed Falls after Sophia, though I doubt she'd have wanted that. The plaque below listed all 3 names etched in bronze that caught the morning light. Every year I leave flowers there, ferns and mountain daisies, the kind Mia used to press between notebook pages. Elena retired not long after. The case had taken more from her than she liked to admit. We spoke one last time at the trailhead, both of us older, worn thin by years of carrying what we couldn't set down. She said the hardest part wasn't catching the men responsible, it was realizing how easily the world had let them exist in plain sight. They were supposed to protect people, she said quietly, and no one ever asked if they should still be trusted to. When she left, I stood by my truck listening to the wind move through the trees. The forest sounded different now, almost hollow. I thought about that photograph, the girls just small shapes in the distance, sunlight warming their backs, and about how close danger can stand without you noticing. Somewhere out there, the water still moves over the stones where their last camp once stood. Every spring, the floods rise and shift them again. Maybe that's the forest's way of remembering, refusing to let the ground go still. That night back home, I pulled the old box from the closet. Inside were their maps, the camera strap, the folded permit with Brooks's signature across the bottom. I added the photograph to the stack and closed the lid. The sound it made, wood sliding against wood, felt final. But final doesn't mean finished. Out the window, rain started again, tapping against the glass like small, patient knocks. I turned off the porch light, though I knew the dark would never be as quiet as it once was. Somewhere beyond the trees, water kept moving, carrying with it everything we thought was gone. The night after Dale Merrow's sentencing, I drove out to the park one last time. It wasn't planned. Sometimes you just find yourself following an old road before you've decided where you're going. The highway was slick from a light rain, the kind that hangs in the air without falling. By the time I reached the Hoe entrance, the ranger booth was empty, just a single bulb burning above the gate moths flickering in its light. I parked by the trailhead, turned off the engine, and let the quiet settle in. The forest was still awake. I could hear water moving somewhere in the dark, the faint cry of an owl, the wind pushing through the tall ferns like a slow breath. It had been 4 years since the girls vanished, but the place hadn't changed much. The signs were newer, brighter, but the air was the same, damp, mineral-rich and full of memory. I walked a short way down the trail, not far, just enough to hear the crunch of gravel under my boots. Every sound out there seems amplified when you're alone, every rustle carrying weight. I stopped when I reached the bend where the creek crosses under the footbridge. That's where the first search party had found their torn campsite. The forest has since swallowed it back, covering what was once chaos with moss and fallen needles. Nature, I suppose, doesn't like scars to stay visible. I leaned against the rail, listening to the water rush beneath, and thought about everything that had unfolded since that summer. 2 men were behind bars now, both of them serving life, one who'd killed another, who'd helped him hide it. The trials were over, the cameras gone, the press moved on to other tragedies. But for those of us who lived it, the noise never really stopped. It just shifted inward. There are nights I still hear the faint echo of those search helicopters in my dreams, the blades thumping like a heartbeat I can't calm. Elena retired that fall. She called to say she was moving east to live with her sister somewhere flat open without trees. I need a horizon I can see all the way across, she said, and I understood exactly what she meant. The woods had taken too much from her, not just her peace, but her belief that the people wearing the badge beside her were always worthy of it. Before she left, she invited me to the dedication of a new safety center funded by the scholarships and donations that followed the case. It wasn't a grand building, just a small office by the visitor lot, but it meant something. Inside, they trained new rangers on crisis management and mental health screenings, things that might have caught Brooks long before he reached that breaking point. I stood there as they cut the ribbon, my hands tucked deep in my jacket pockets, and watched the young trainees shake hands, eager and untested. Some part of me wanted to warn them that not every danger comes from the wild. But I kept quiet. Sometimes silence is the only language that feels honest. The families found their own ways forward. Sophia's brother Javier poured everything into the scholarship. He started the Sophia Reed Fund. Each year, 3 young women receive grants to study environmental science or outdoor leadership. Lila's mother, Priya, turned her grief into something almost gentle. She built a memorial garden outside the elementary school where her daughter once taught. On the first spring bloom, she invites the children out to plant wildflowers, saying they grow best when kindness tends them. I've been there twice. The soil always smells faintly of rain, and the laughter of the kids makes the air lighter. As for me, I still live in the same house on Park Avenue. I still keep the porch light on some nights, not out of habit, but out of gratitude. It reminds me of what love does when it doesn't know what else to be. It waits. The box that once held evidence now sits in the back of my closet, unopened for years. Inside are the same items: Mia's camera, strapped, their maps, the signed permit. And now, one more thing the locket restored: polished the photo inside, wiped clean of the years it spent buried in the earth. It no longer feels like an object of mourning. It's a reminder that even when the worst has already happened, there are pieces that can still be found, still held. Every July, the park hosts a memorial hike. It's quiet, private, not for cameras or speeches. The first year, maybe 20 of us showed up. By the third, there were hundreds: hikers, rangers, families who'd lost someone of their own to the wilderness. We start at dawn and walk the same loop the girls once planned, ending at the lake where their lives ended too. The trail has changed, the old bridge replaced, new warning markers installed, but the trees still look the same. Sometimes when the wind shifts, you can almost hear their laughter rolling through the branches. Not the sound of fear or pain, but joy. The sound of 3 friends who believed the world would stay kind. Standing at that lake the first time after the trail reopened, I felt something strange. Not peace, exactly, but permission. Permission to let the silence fill the space where anger used to live. To understand that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means learning to coexist with what remains. The water that took them now reflects their names on the plaque that stands by the shore. When the morning sun hits it just right, their reflections ripple across the surface like they're part of the current, always moving, never truly gone. I think about Brooks sometimes, how a man who once vowed to protect the wild could twist it into a hiding place for his own darkness. I don't dwell on him. He took enough. But I think of what his choices stole from all of us: trust, innocence, a sense of safety that once seemed unshakable. I remember Elena's words during her testimony. The forest didn't kill those girls. A man did. The trees just kept the secret until we were ready to listen. I've carried that line with me ever since. It taught me that truth, like water, always finds a way out. It might take years, even decades, but it never stops moving toward the light. There's a small museum now in Port Angeles called Lost Trails. It holds artifacts from cases like this: the maps, the photos, the found objects. When it opened, they asked if I'd loan Mia's notebook. I said yes. It sits in a glass case open to her last entry, the handwriting soft but clear. Heard footsteps outside the tent. Hope it's nothing. The words still shake me, but I'm grateful they exist. They're her voice, her final record of that night, and a warning that echoes beyond her own story. When visitors read it, they pause. Some reach out instinctively, as if they could touch the page and change what came next. But all we can do now is remember. I see her in small moments when the light filters through fog just right, or when I catch the smell of pine after a storm. I hear her laughter when the neighbors' kids chase each other down the street, carefree and loud. Time doesn't heal, not in the way people promise you it will. It simply softens the edges, so you can carry the shape of what happened without it cutting you open every time you touch it. There's a bench near the trailhead now, carved from cedar and facing west. On clear evenings, the setting sun burns through the mist and hits the brass plate in the middle. It reads, "For Sophia, Lila, and Mia Explorers, Teachers' Daughters. May the wild remember your light." I sit there when I visit, watching the last bit of daylight fade through the trees. The forest feels quieter now, but not empty. More like it's listening, finally listening to the stories that once went unheard. I've come to believe that places hold memory just like people do. You can clear the trails, build new signs, seal the caves, but the land remembers. Every footstep, every whisper, every promise broken, or kept its stays woven into the roots. That's what I hear now when the wind passes through the evergreens. Not fear, not ghosts, just memory, still breathing under all that green. When I stand at that spot by the creek where their laughter was last heard, I don't see the crime anymore. I see who they were, 3 young women, fearless, curious, alive in a world they believed was good. That's how I choose to keep them. Not as victims of one man's madness, but as proof that courage can exist even in the face of tragedy. The world can take almost everything from you, but not the love that made it hurt in the first place. That stays. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, not for noise, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Because remembering is the one thing we owe to those who can't come back. And sometimes when we say their names out loud, it's enough to keep the silence from winning.